Okay, allow me to now call upon Lydia Pilar Arriagada Garcia, Images for Inclusion, Inc. Lydia,
Gracias,
are you
Madam
present?
Presidente.
Thank you, Madam. I am Lydia Garcia, and I'm speaking on behalf of the NGO Images for Inclusion. In Chile, not only indigenous peoples are not recognized within the Constitution, but policies, plans, programs, standards, actions, and other legal instruments have not adopted measures to attain the goals and purposes of the Declaration. In addition, racism and colonialism continue to be impregnated in state educational institutions, which are settled in indigenous areas, whereby there isn't a significant inclusion of indigenous protocols which respect and value cultural diversity and linguistic diversity of indigenous peoples. There's a lack of consultation and cooperation, and institutional colonialism persists, which continues forced assimilation. This is a model which does not represent the indigenous peoples. Our NGO has undertaken significant efforts to promote the recommendations issued by the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues in its report in the 23rd session on the development of inclusion strategies for indigenous peoples in decision-making as to green financing and funding. However, there's an apparent political blockade and disagreement on the part of the Chilean authorities not to take part in the discussions on the rights of indigenous peoples with indigenous peoples on climate change. And they haven't informed citizens, including indigenous peoples, as to these debating fora which debate their rights, for example, our seminar. It is urgent to create mechanisms to implement the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Chile. To do this, Chile must adopt legislative measures which promote, protect and defend the rights of indigenous peoples, set out in all articles of the Declaration. But it cannot do that, first of all, without having effective, inclusive and participatory consultation. That is why we respectfully request EMRIP to urge Chile to do the following: to promote within its legislation consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples on climate change, and that it adopt appropriate measures, including legislative ones, to attain the goals of the Declaration. For example, the inclusion of indigenous science, specifically in the framework law on climate change, so that policies, plans, programs, standards, actions and other instruments can also be based on indigenous scientific principles. In addition to that, they protect indigenous land by land ownership, enabling them to exercise self-determination set out in Article 3 of the Declaration. There must be an incentive for the participation of the Chilean government at the municipal, regional and national levels, including CONADI. This is a body which discusses and promotes the rights of indigenous peoples on climate change and indigenous science, particularly when it comes to green funding and free, prior and informed consent. It must create a transparent mechanism which provides accountability as to the effective, participatory and inclusiveness of indigenous peoples in plans and actions on climate change to combat the impact of climate change at the municipal, regional and national levels. Lastly, we request EMRIP to urge United Nations agencies and relevant funding agencies to promote their participation in these bodies. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Lydia.